Welcome to Regulate Tech with me, Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad, and
with me, Richard Allan.
So today we're going to discuss a subject that has been at the center of the tech policy debate, then largely vanished, and now has come back with full force: encryption. So encryption, the ability to hide your messages, to make sure that only the intended receiver reads them, is a very old technology. It's existed for as long as human communication has existed, and there is no end of ciphers that have been used throughout human history in more or less inventive ways. But when technology entered the stage, it was suddenly possible to encrypt large amounts of information and communication in ways that were automated. And this meant that everyone got access to communication that was largely private, something that privacy advocates hailed as a huge step forward. And law enforcement agencies warned could mean that the bad guys now finally could act with impertinence without any risk of ever getting caught, because it was not possible to eavesdrop on them anymore. This is a debate that we've been through once in the 1990s, the cipher wars, where cypherpunks, as they were called, debated the government on everything from built-in eavesdropping in chips, the so-called clipper chip, to backdoors and different kinds of encryption, or export controls on encryption, which led to one of the most interesting publications that I own in my library, which is the source code to Pretty Good Privacy. By Phil Zimmerman. It's an entire book full of source code, because you could always export a book, even if you couldn't export a computer program, because books were solidly protected under the First Amendment. So we have a lot of different issues intersecting here. We have First Amendment issues, law enforcement issues, security issues, technology issues, and we are now in a position where more and more governments are asking companies to decrypt or provide backdoors to, or stop people from using encrypted communication services such as Signal or Telegram or WhatsApp or what have you. So how will this go? Where will we end up, Richard?
Yeah, I think we will end up with end-to-end encrypted services at scale still being available, and I think you were right to put your finger on the thing that's changed, which is not the introduction of end-to-end encryption. People always have been able to do it, but what's changed is it's become a consumer product, that it's been built into consumer products, so it's operating at a much greater scale than it would have done previously. And really, that's the heart of the debate, because I don't think there's anyone serious in government who thinks that you could stop a very determined individual from communicating privately with another determined individual, because there's a million different ways they could do that. What we're really debating is whether ordinary rank and file people in their daily communications should benefit from that additional level of privacy. And I mean, the reason we're debating, I think, is the government does have a point to say, look, they can say, look, those same, if you like, regular citizens also really care about security. And so if you're saying to them, yes, you're worried about your privacy, but I think I can only stop terrorists attacking you if I can compromise it in some way, that is a valid debate. It's not one for the determined individual. They don't care. They're quite happily doing it, but it's a valid one for that mass market deployment of encryption.
But the question here is, if we sort of disentangle the logic of this issue, the first question we have to answer then is, has the advent of mass communication and mass encryption really changed the game that much? Or is it just mass communication that has changed it? Because you can imagine that if you are a bad person and you want to do bad things, if you have harmful intentions, then you can find any small channel to communicate in. You can use Discord, or you could use a very small chat service, or you could send messages in a very, in a game or something like that. The way you communicate would not necessarily be dependent on encryption as such. But when we're identifying encryption as the heart of the problem, we're saying that this particular technology is what makes it impossible to protect citizens. How do you prove that? Because you could arguably say, if you were a citizen, you would say, well, I'm willing to give up some of my privacy if you can give me some evidence that doing so would significantly increase my security or reduce the risk. But how would you do that?
Yeah, I think what we can say is that law enforcement agencies are losing a tool that they had available to them. The tool was interception. So again, since time immemorial, because they could always get letters as they went through the postal system. But more recently, with telecommunication systems, since the 20th century, they've always had the ability to do what's called a wiretap in America, but they could get a device inserted into a phone network, and they could listen in on people's phone calls. And then more recently, certainly on the SMS network, the mobile operators, they could put a device in, the mobile operators would hand them all of the SMS messages. They could read the SMS messages going to somebody they were interested in. And it's certainly a fact that if they listen in or try to capture all the data going over the internet from a particular person, and they were using an encrypted messaging service, one of the popular ones you listed, they can no longer sit there and read the messages. So that's true. Question then is,
But could they ever do that with the amount of messages going over these networks? Don't you have to have an idea of who it is you're actually tracking first?
No, this is where you've got somebody targeted. So I think we need, again, to break this out. There's sort of mass surveillance. We're not talking about that. And I think mass surveillance generally has involved so these two types of data: communications data, who's talking to whom, has tended to be the sort of mass surveillance. We're looking for who's connected to whom, but what are they saying to each other has mostly been a targeted thing that governments do. They know that, Nicklas Lundblad is the bad guy they don't like. They know your phone number, they know your email address, and they say to your phone company, can we listen to all of Nicklas's phone calls? Can we see all of Nicklas's SMSs? So that's that. And that's the thing they've lost, because if Nicklas is now using WhatsApp, they can't listen to your calls, they can't intercept your messages, which is why you like the product. So that's gone. And yes, I don't think.
But I want to just stop there, because I think most people don't like the product because it's encrypted, but because their friends are on it.
Exactly.
I don't think it's a selling argument for like your average consumer. This is an encrypted. It sounds good, right? But if you ask people why are you on WhatsApp, they will say my family's on WhatsApp, my friends are on WhatsApp, and that's why I'm there.
Exactly, and this is exactly the line the government are pushing, or governments like the UK government are promoting, to say this isn't the critical feature. So if you didn't encrypt, then everything would be fine, and most users would still be comfortable with it. So they are basically arguing to go back. People use the phone system even knowing that they could always get a wiretap, and the government will say, look, what you need to rely on is the fact that we, the government, will only get a wiretap if you're a bad guy. So if you're a good guy, then we're not going to get a wiretap anyway. So your phone calls are private, not because they're technically private, not because we couldn't read them or listen in on them, but because we won't listen in on them. And they're saying, let us have that status quo rolled over into this new world of new communication services. So don't encrypt them all the time for everyone, and you'll be fine. And as I say, I think that's a reasonable argument.
But the counter argument would then be, look, this is a service that's mainstream. Most people who are using them are, people who are old, people who are not that tech savvy, people who are just trying to keep in touch with each other. Removing the encryption makes them vulnerable to attacks from cyber fraudsters, from people who want to attack or target them, read their messages, or in different ways, kidnap their identity. There's a whole set of risks that encryption has been set up to protect. So you have this trade-off between making sure that the millions of people or the billions of people who are innocent on this service cannot be targeted by bad actors from an information security perspective, to those, very few individuals that are engaged in activities that are potentially dangerous for, say, national security or for severe crimes, and sort of making sure that they can't get away with it. But how do you balance that?
Yeah, so I think you're right. So I think the fundamental arguments, for why we will offer encrypted services to people, even where they've not explicitly said that's the most important thing to them, is that the types of attack have grown over time. internet services are now so fundamental to us that we're exchanging much more sensitive information than we ever would have done previously. And it's always interesting talking to politicians about this, because politicians, lots of them are in WhatsApp groups and other spaces where they're sharing information they would hate ever to get out, and they would be a prime target for anyone who wanted to sort of capture information. So the liability for them individually has increased, or the risk has increased significantly. Therefore, the case for encryption becomes stronger. So I think that's one piece of it. The other piece that we shouldn't ignore is the liability of the companies, because, again, we've got this whole body of law, privacy law, electronic communications privacy regulation in Europe, all of this stuff, where increasingly we're saying to companies, look, if somebody did get through your defenses and they were able to read messages and bad things happen, we're going to hold you liable for millions, if not billions of dollars of liability for that. So we're saying to companies, you must do everything you possibly can to keep communications private. And if one of the things you could do is encryption, you almost imagine a situation where there's one bit of government saying, you must not encrypt communications so we can access them, and another bit of government, the Data Protection Agency, saying, if you don't encrypt the communications, you're negligent because you're now exposing your customers to risk. So we're in this world that is much more high stakes. I think it's ever been much more high stakes than it was with the telephone, where you're banking, you still walked into the bank branch and you had pieces of paper that you handed over to the modern world, where much more high stakes stuff is happening online. And we have this much higher expectation of companies that they will take all reasonable measures. Therefore, they must consider encryption to try and protect that. That's the new landscape. I think really a lot of the big questions are around, how do we do investigations in this world? So if in the old world, you're a law enforcement agent and one of your tools was a wiretap and you've lost that tool, what tools can you have in place of that will help you still catch bad guys, that might work in an all encrypted environment? I think that perhaps is the most fruitful area to look at, to not look over your shoulder backwards and go, can we have the wiretap back? But to say, okay, in this new world where actually there's far more data about the bad guys out there as well, what is it that you could have that would allow you to catch them, prosecute them, and protect the citizens, that doesn't involve a wiretap of unencrypted communications?
Or use the fact that people have such reliance on encryption that you create an alternative chat service that caters to criminals and have them think that that's the best service they can use, like they did with EncroChat, right? You could
exactly.
see a lot of different, really inventive ways of approaching exactly the problem you describe.
I mean, that's one way of doing it. And the others are, again, I often get frustrated in this debate because people say, well, end-to-end encryption, we can't catch the paedophile who's sharing illegal images or whatever it is. Actually, we can. And the way that they do it is, typically it's happening in a group of people. What's happening is law enforcement's caught one person. They've got their phone. All of the messages are, of course, are unencrypted on the phone. They're all visible. They've got that person either because that person is doing a deal with the authorities, or because they're being threatened with extra sanctions, whatever it is. That person is sharing with law enforcement all of the chats and all of the data unencrypted. And then law enforcement can see now the 30 other people they were sharing with can follow leads. I think the really interesting thing there is that that now I think law enforcement has a reasonable expectation that the platforms will help them to pursue those leads. It doesn't require any decryption. It just requires the platforms, for example, to help them associate IP addresses or email addresses or phone numbers with the other people in the network. So for me, part of the new environment is companies, I don't think, should be made to decrypt all of the communications, but where law enforcement has got someone and they can see that they're communicating with others illegally, causing serious harm, the company should be willing to give what data they have got, which is typically data around how the people use the service, in traffic order to help those law enforcement agencies. Yeah, it's traffic data. It's anything essentially they can, or another example. I mean, sometimes it's the investigation. Sometimes it's just shutting things down, where you can see that somebody's involved in 50 different groups that are all bad, and there's a pattern to the way those groups have been set up or named. Even if the company can't see the communications inside the groups, I don't personally think it's unreasonable, where you have pretty compelling evidence they're being used for bad things, for law enforcement to say, look, shut these down, get rid of them. And if I was working in a company, I'd feel, again, pretty morally bound to do that if you have very good evidence that these are not groups with the political opposition. It's a serious law enforcement agency in a human rights respecting environment that is telling you these groups are coordinating violence or abuse of some form. You should cooperate with them. So to me, the new world is, don't get rid of the encryption, but do have a reasonable expectation of cooperation, so that investigations and the stopping the bad things can still happen. And the unsustainable position is, as a company, we're going to do nothing. It's not our problem. I don't see. We've encrypted it all. We can't see any of it. It's not our problem. Law enforcement, go away. I don't see that as a particularly defensible position, sort of morally, or in terms of sustainably defending the encrypted service.
No, and that also speaks to some of the logic. And I think that for a large company that is well established in the consumer space, it is going to want to collaborate in ways that doesn't necessarily put the majority of all its innocent users at risk. Because I think that's sort of a given. It's not just sort of because they do it out of the goodness of their heart. There's also a reputational logic to it. The challenge, though, the way this issue is currently evolving in many countries, is that they're asking WhatsApp and other more well-known messaging services to remove end-to-end encryption. And they might well do that for the very same reason you described, that companies cannot say we will not do anything or we won't do this. And if they were to do that, if they were to remove those, we would end up in one of the situations that's very common in policy, which is what is usually referred to as a displacement effect, which is you have this service where you thought that all of the bad guys were, you removed the end-to-end encryption from them, and they wisely just moved on to another service. And there are plenty of other services that are not interested in removing encryption at all, or installing backdoors or something like that. So how do you deal with displacement effects that are so clear in this particular case?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, as a mainstream company, you actually want to create a displacement effect. So, and again, I think this is a choice, but I would argue that the best position for a mainstream company to be in is that they are making it clear that, yes, while they offer end-to-end encryption, they do cooperate with law enforcement. And if you're intending to use the service for committing serious crime, go somewhere else. It's not safe. You don't want your service to be safe for very serious criminals. You want them to get the message to go elsewhere. So there's a certain amount of that I think you can do anyway. But you're right. If you then, and this is a bit that worries me more in a sense, is there's a whole raft, there's serious criminals. There are always going to be serious criminals, wherever they are, whatever service they use. There's a whole raft of other people who I think are probably not serious criminals, but do get concerned about privacy. And what you don't want to do is to move them away from the mainstream services. They should be using the mainstream services. It's the right service for them. You then push them into a dodgier, if I can put it that way, service. And so you've now got, a raft of ordinary citizens who are now using the really, really risky service. And that can lead to all kinds of consequences. The risky service, the non-mainstream service might be a front for somebody, might not be legit at all, might be not encrypting the data like it said it was doing. There could be all sorts of things going on there. So that you want displacement of all the really bad people to EncroChat or some compromise service, ideally. What you don't want is displacement of regular citizens into what commonly gets called things like the dark web. You don't displace them off. And it's that balance I think we need to look at. And from a public policy point of view, I think it's really important to look at the whole picture. And the debate often just centers on one sort of sliver of it. So it's only about banking, or it's only about the really hard criminals, or whatever it is. I think we actually just need to look at the whole picture and say, okay, let's assume a world in which these big services like WhatsApp and others are offering end-to-end encryption that is truly secure to hundreds of millions of people, and they are working well with law enforcement. Let's look at that world, pros and cons. Let's look at a world in which we've told them they can't, and now we've maybe displaced 20% of their users off somewhere else, and maybe now we're getting more compromise of the data going through WhatsApp, and maybe now we're getting people that we wouldn't want to intercept communications intercepting communications, and maybe governments are falling because their communications are being intercepted and put out there. Remember the old WikiLeaks story about the diplomatic cables? So you need to look at that whole picture, all of the consequences of scenario one, mainstream end-to-end encryption. Scenario two, end-to-end encryption has gone from the mainstream, is now only on the fringes.
And another thing that happens as this issue evolves over time, if you look at the logic when displacement is introduced, is that the natural reaction is to try to find different choke points in the network. So you could imagine, or you could predict, that once you realize from the regulator side that we're not going to be able, even if the large companies comply and remove their end-to-end encryption, to remove end-to-end encryption as a phenomenon or as a capacity or capability on the market, what is going to happen then is that you're going to immediately try to move to, say, for example, the app stores, and say you cannot offer any apps that have end-to-end encryption. That's the predictable next step in this logic, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, because I mean, again, if WhatsApp announced tomorrow that we're getting rid of end-to-end encryption, I think there will be a huge market demand for the app that you download that says we will encrypt all your messages before they get into WhatsApp. And I can imagine, again, frankly, all the leading politicians in my own country would sign up for that. In fact, they might even get their own party IT departments telling them they should sign up for it, because they want that level of privacy and security. So it's just we would just create that market. And you're right. And then the authorities might then have to say we're now going to ban these other apps that would encrypt the message. That it just goes on and on. So it seems to me, again, you've got to look at the whole picture. You've got to play through the scenarios in their entirety, and the risk in the debate is we just take these tiny slices. Do you hate terrorists and pedophiles, or do you love banking? And it's a much bigger and more complex picture. And again, if you push in one place, something is going to pop up somewhere else, and we need to try and model that out as best we can before taking drastic decisions.
And after all, encryption is only a kind of math. So prohibiting encryption in apps is one thing, but encryption can then be used in so many other different ways. You can encrypt a message on your computer, as we did with PGP, and then send it with email, and it still will not be possible to decrypt because those technologies or those algorithms are already out of the box. Why do you think encryption has become such a political hotspot? Is it because the notion of the bad guys being able to keep a secret is so salient in the public mind? We don't want them to be able to do that. We don't want to afford them those dark rooms in which they can make deals or recruit kids to gang violence. Or why is this issue recurring, and why is it recurring now, do you think?
I mean, I think again, from a technology point of view, we need to understand the mindset of the people doing investigations. These are, in my experience, are good people. They're public servants. We're paying their salaries, and we're asking them to catch the bad people who are going to hurt us. And we've made their lives more difficult as tech companies. We have. And again, I don't think you can back away from that. By introducing this technology, we've taken one of the tools out of their toolbox, which is this wiretapping tool. And it's frustrating in this period of transition. It's frustrating for them. Again, if you look at the totality, we give them a whole bunch of other tools, but just for that
tools, and we have provided more security and safety to the citizens, arguably, who cannot now be attacked. And I think this is the thing. You're putting your finger on something really important, which is that we're looking at a specific set of crimes and harms, and we're saying this specific set of harms and crimes are probably protected by encryption, but we're not looking at this vast array of possible harms that could come from weakening information security protections in systems overall. So there's something about this set of harms, and I think you said this earlier, it's pedophiles and terrorists that are so they're so significant and they're so horrible that it kind of dwarfs the massive effects it would have to have people be unprotected overall in their communications as a regular state of affairs, right?
Yeah, and for somebody who's investigating it, I mean, they are, doing amazing work to if you were in that position, you're trying to protect people from being blown up at a pop concert. The Taylor Swift concert threats
Yeah.
recently. You've identified someone 10 years ago. You would go, great, let's put a wiretap, go to the local telephone company, put a wiretap on that person's phone, listening to all their calls, and you would be able to do your job, which is keeping people alive. You're on a mission. You really care about that. Today, it's like, oh God, they're using one of these services. I can't get in. There are ways I can try and plant a software bug on their phone. There's things I can do, but it is, my life is harder, and I'm doing something which is absolutely critical and fundamental. And yes, the fact that everybody's banking might be a little less secure and so on is a worry. But for the person in that position as an investigator, trying to stop people getting blown up tomorrow, that feels quite abstract. And that investigator is then talking to the politician, and they're saying to the politician, look, someone is going to get blown up tomorrow that I could have stopped if I'd been able to read the messages. And the politician is going to say, I don't want that on me. So what can I do? And what I can do is tell them they can't encrypt anymore. And so that chain is there, and it's a real thing, and you have to respect it. I don't think you can just say, well, I've used this phrase before. It's a horrible phrase, but a little bit of terrorism is the price worth paying for the open internet. It's not, actually. We should be able to do both, and that's why I say, to me, the right stance is, okay, you can't listen in on the messages, but I would expect any responsible company to want to work very closely with those investigators who are trying to stop people getting blown up at concerts, to do everything they can to try and help them catch the people that they need to catch. It's certainly not to kind of wash their hands of it. Oh, it's encrypted, not my problem.
And it would be useful, I think, in the wider discussions, because this is the other thing that we're missing. We're missing that data. Well, how many of the harms that have happened in the last 5 years could have been stopped if end-to-end encryption didn't exist, and how much harm was prevented by making sure that end-to-end encryption was in place? We don't have those relative weights or those pieces of evidence available to us, and it's going to be really, really hard to get them. But this was a part of the early discussion about encryption in the 90s. There was a lot of testimony and research into how much of the FBI's active case files that were in some way interrupted or stopped by a lack of ability to decrypt messages. And the result was, if I remember correctly, quite shocking, because they had no cases in which they said that encryption was the deciding factor that made it impossible for us to solve this. And I wonder. I keep wondering what the actual numbers would be today, and I'm actually quite agnostic about this. I think they could be much higher because of the prevalence of this as a consumer product that you said in the beginning. But I also wonder how much of what an intelligence agency or an anti-terrorist agency does is not dependent on knowing the people. The part of intelligence called HumInt, or human intelligence, understanding these networks, how they work, who is interacting with whom, and those kinds of things are sort of less dependent on end-to-end encryption networks, it seems to me.
That's right. I think that zooming out, I've heard those numbers as well. And people trying to make the case will highlight the cases where they were frustrated. But I think to zoom out and say, in totality, where you have cooperative internet service providers, is a villain who is using the internet today more or less likely to be caught than a villain, prior to using the internet? Which is where's the trend going? I'd love to see the data. My instinct tells me that they're leaving more and more footprints and actually making it more likely they'll get caught. So it is, and actually that's why I worry about some of the rhetoric. The rhetoric is almost, oh God, we can't touch them because they're using end-to-end encrypted messaging services. Really unhelpful, because the villain starts to feel they've got impunity. I actually think if it's supported by evidence, a better message is, look, villain, if you are using the internet, you're going to be leaving traces. Providers will be giving us the data we need, other forms of data, and we're actually much more likely to catch you than otherwise. But again, I'd love to see the data to support that line of argumentation.
Yes, and I really think it would be, again, we come back to this old saw about evidence-based policymaking. Asking for the evidence in this particular case, understanding the structure of the harm would be interesting. Also, because we know that entirely new threat models need to be taken into account. It's possible now to produce a deep fake voice that can call you up on your WhatsApp and say, "I'm your mother. I need you to send me some money." So the kinds of attacks that you could face, unless you had that end-to-end encryption and the guarantee of sort of security in your communications, are also changing. And so as you put all these different things together, you get a much more holistic perspective on what are the right policy options to do here. And I think it's such an interesting question, because it's going to be pivotal what happens in the next 6 to 12 months, where a lot of governments are looking into whether to ban end-to-end encryption, to require that there are backdoors installed into end-to-end encryption systems, which is essentially making sure that those end-to-end encryption systems are less secure than they are now, but it's a bit of a partial solution. And the Swedish and Danish governments have been talking about this quite a lot as well, because they're worried about gang violence and the recruitment of young people into gang violence networks through end-to-end encrypted communication services. So let's end this with a little bit of a prediction. I'm interested in, do you think that within the European Union, do you think there will be any country in which WhatsApp will not be offered as end-to-end encrypted at the end of the year?
I think there is a reasonable prospect of that happening, because I do think, there are courts. I think it could be court-driven, that there will be a court in a particular country where there's a horrendous case, and the law enforcement makes the compelling argument that this was critical to them failing to prevent a horrible crime. I think that's always possible, and indeed quite likely. That will happen somewhere. So I think that's the scenario. It's that there's some kind of awful crime. Law enforcement explains that the problem was the end-to-end encryption service. The policymakers and or judges feel they have to act. The order is made. Then there'll be a whole process of it playing out and being challenged and so on. But I do have to say, I think it's quite likely somewhere those orders will be made, and then we'll be dealing with that scenario. And then the company, again, just be really candid, I think company will then have to withdraw from the market, not because it necessarily wants to, but because again, the whole weight of law at the moment on privacy says you can't lie to your customers. You've got to be totally honest with them, quite rightly. And so end-to-end encryption is a pretty binary state. It either is real or it's not. You are not offering an end-to-end encrypted secure service if you've got any kind of backdoor or anything going on there that raises a doubt. So therefore, if you cannot guarantee, it would be foolish in the extreme for any company to say they're offering an end-to-end encrypted service if they're genuinely not doing so. So if they had the court order and they felt they needed to comply, their only choice, I think, is to get out of that market, because, of course, the people in that country will be communicating with people in other countries, if you follow logic. So if you want to offer the end-to-end encrypted service in the rest of the world and still be able to say it's secure, you can't have the encryption broken in anywhere in the chain. You've got to shut the country out where the end-to-end encryption has been ordered to be broken. So that's
on that predictive note, I think we'll end this discussion. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. And this is Encryption is the issue that probably is going to come back again and again. But with this prediction and with the discussion, let us know if you have any questions. And thanks for listening.